Among our speakers tonight, I'm very glad to say that we have a very interesting and interdisciplinary panel. This is important because UK-EU relations interferes with a number of policy areas, interferes with law and constitutional affairs, interferes with a number of policies, environment, human rights, migration, to name a few, many others, the economy as well. So we are very lucky to be able to hear from, to have different perspectives on this relationship and an informal assessment about Theresa May's term so far as Prime Minister. I would like to introduce you the speakers. You have Professor Vera Troegar, from a colleague from the Economics Department, Ben Farrand from the Law School, Andreas Murr from PAIS, Davide Morisi from the Center for Media Pluralism and Freedom, from the European University Institute in Florence, and Anna Wilson, thank you very much for coming from the Young European Movement, and also Warwick student in history. Is that? In the history department. Okay. I will. You won't hear me speaking more, I guess, very little, as little as possible. I will just have the unpleasant task to control a little bit for the time, so we have time to speak and save time for your questions and comments from the audience. Okay, once again, thank you very much for coming. There's some space at the front. I know there are not enough chairs. I'm sorry about that, but I'm happy that I miscalculated and underestimated the number of people who would turn up. I'll keep that in mind for next events. Well, I have nothing more to say. I would just like to welcome, I would like to, if you don't mind, to speak to start with Professor Vera Troegar from Economics Department. Thank you. I cannot thank you enough. And very last thing, I'm sorry, I just had to say it. I would like to say a big thank you for the speakers who devoted a little bit of their time to come, and from people in the department who gave me all the support: Chrissy, Blanca, Colin, Robin. I'm sorry, you probably don't know them, but I would like to thank them because otherwise the event, Fiona, the event had never ever taken off. Okay. All right, I'm pretty much done. I leave the floor to you, and I'll just let you know if you, I'll leave 10-15 minutes max to each speaker, and then questions from you guys, okay? Thank you very much for coming.
Let me just put on this mic. Okay, can you all hear me? Fine? Okay, welcome again. Thank you for coming. Thanks for your interest in this event. I want to give you a little bit of food for thought, and I want to provoke a little bit, but I hope that all my provocations are actually fact and evidence-based. So this is obviously Theresa May at the Birmingham Conservative Party conference. And so somebody, a colleague of mine, a newspaper columnist, characterized Theresa May as a suspicious remainer before June 23. And Theresa May has reinvented herself as the leader best equipped to carry out the wishes of the 52% who voted for leaving the EU, right? So that's kind of how she reinvented herself over the last few months. So she is clearly, and that's what we have seen over the last few months, hurtling towards a hard Brexit, right? But what does this mean, a hard Brexit, right? And we have really seen glimpses of this during the Conservative Party conference. So what this really means is probably from an economic point of view, leaving the EU without favorable trade terms, right? Especially if no deal can be struck after the 2 years after Article 50 is triggered, right? This will mean leaving the single market. Why is that the case? Because, of course, the most contentious issue here is immigration from EU member states. And that would violate the 4 pillars, right? Free movement of capital, services, people, and what's the last one? Goods. Goods. Yeah, of course, goods, right? Thank you. So it was all, well, a hard Brexit would also mean that the UK would have to leave the tariff and customs union. Because, of course, what Theresa May wants and what a lot of hardline Brexiters want is that they want to negotiate bilateral trade deals, and they can't do that if they are staying in the tariff and customs union, because then the European Commission would negotiate on behalf of Great Britain these deals. So in the end, it seems like if hard Brexit really is something that will be implemented, then we will be reverting back to WTO rules, and I will talk about this just in a minute, right? Also, what will happen, and what she already announced, is that the UK will be leaving the jurisdictions of the European Court of Justice, and I will not talk about this, but I guess there's somebody else in here who will talk about the implications of this a little bit. Let me just give a little picture here, what happened, right? What we know is that Brexit happened, or UK voters decided that they wanted to leave the EU on 23rd of June this year. And since then, the British pound has dropped by 17%, both towards the euro and the US dollar, right? But I will talk a little bit more about what this means, but we can track some events and how the exchange rate actually reacted to what Theresa May announced, right? So what we see here is 23rd of June, right? That's the euro pound exchange rate. On 5th July, we see a big drop here, and that was the first round of parliament voting of the Conservative members of parliament who voted in favor of Theresa May, right? So already the markets anticipated that she might actually stand for hard Brexit. And then on 15th July, the markets rallied a little bit again because Theresa May met with Nicola Sturgeon, and it was somehow expected that if Scotland vetoes a Brexit, then this would not happen, right? We know now differently. And then on 5th October, so this month here, you see a sharp drop again in the pound, and that was when Theresa May basically implemented her stance on a hard Brexit. When she said, Brexit is Brexit, we will have a hard line on EU immigration, and that basically implies a hard Brexit and leaving the single market, right? And then yesterday, the pound rallied again a little bit, because yesterday it was clear that Theresa May would need parliamentary approval before she can actually trigger Article 50, which kind of gives soft Brexiteers a little bit more of room for maneuver. So what does it mean, a hard Brexit again, right? So what we know from Theresa May herself is that she said Brexit is Brexit at the Conservative conference, that Article 50 will be triggered before the end of March next year, which is really bad because she could not strike any deals beforehand, right? She had to say when the Article 50 will be triggered before she actually could enter any negotiations with other European leaders. So the time in this sense is on Europe's side and not on Britain's side, because if we leave without a deal, then we will just revert back to WTO rules, and that will be really bad for trade, at least in the short or medium term. She will drive a hard line on immigration, which then implies all these other things, right? Leaving the tariffs union and leaving the single market. So there was a lot of rhetoric at the conference, and she really knew how to speak to the right wing of the party and to all these, blue-collar workers who actually voted for Brexit and talking about taking back control. This is a turning point for our country. The only one who tried to caution a little bit against Brexit at the conference was the Treasurer, Philip Hammond, and he basically said, look, we voted for Brexit, but people clearly didn't vote to become poorer or less secure. And the Treasury has good estimates that show that over the next 15 years, we might lose up to 9.5% in GDP, right? So that's exactly what I just said. That's what the Treasury expects. There's an internal paper that just came out last week that basically said, okay, the Treasury would probably lose about 66 billion in tax revenue over the next 15 years, and about 9.5% the GDP would fall in the next 15 years. And these forecasts are very consistent with the Center for European Performance, for Economic Performance at the LSE and other forecasts, right? The interesting bit, of course, is that these people who have a lot of insights forecasted this already way before Brexit. In his May letter to the governor of the Bank of England, Hammond actually said, okay, Brexit will create a lose-lose situation. Either inflation will rise and this will impact on family incomes, or growth will reduce and that reduces because of productivity reduction, and that reduces or this increases unemployment. And so family will be hit by unemployment on the other side and lower growth, right? Of course, now we are waiting for Hammond's autumn statement. It's already clear that these austerity plans that were implemented under Cameron have been abandoned. And I expect, at least, and a lot of other economists expect, that there will be a fiscal stimulus package announced in case of hard Brexit. Yeah, what happened to inflation, right? This is a time where we all know really what happens to inflation, right, because of the Tesco-Unilever dispute over who bears the cost of increased retail prices, production prices due to the weak pound, right? And for the Marmite lovers, that might be bad news very soon. I'm a Marmite hater, so it's not so bad for me. But so see, inflation jumped to 1% in September. And the figures just came out yesterday, which is the largest jump since Brexit, the largest jump in the last 2 years. The Office for National Statistics hurried right yesterday to say, oh, this has nothing to do with the weak pound, right? And this has two sides. If it's true that this has nothing to do with the weak pound, then the worst is yet to come, right? Because then that means basically retailers have not given yet the weak pound, the higher costs due to the higher import prices due to the weak pound to the customer. On the other hand, the increase was basically in petrol and clothing, and this is really a good sign that import costs already trickling through to the customers at the high street, because oil is, for example, priced in dollars, right? More oil. Also, the Bank of England now, they have reduced their base interest rate to 0.25% in August, and have increased quantitative easing. And Mark Carney just last week said, look, I'm prepared to accept higher inflation over target inflation for a longer period of time, because that's the only thing we can do to actually counterbalance the to be expected lower growth and larger gap in output, right? But there's only so much monetary policy can do, right? And really what is to be expected that the British economy, if there's a hard Brexit, will have to adjust to a much lower path of growth, and that will be painful. Inflation, of course, is a double-edged sword, but low-income families will suffer most right now because, for example, tax credits and benefits are frozen in cash terms, right, until 2020. And of course, low-income families consume most of the things that will be hit hardest by increased inflation, right? And so we expect 17% in fall of the exchange rate, about 20 to 30% of this will trickle through to the consumers in the end. So we can expect another 3.5, or we can expect a 3.5 to 5% inflation over the next 2 years. So we know that business leaders, bankers, they're all caution against a hard Brexit. We also know that Brussels has a very different priority, and that is really to keep the unity and strength of the remaining EU members together, right? And from all we have heard from the main leaders, Angela Merkel and the French President François Hollande, they will not budge on the 4 pillars, right? The 4 free movements. And so this already shows that Theresa May actually failed to negotiate any kind of pre-deal with the leaders of the EU member states before she had to set the deadline for Article 50 to be triggered, right? So these are numbers that were forecast from the Center for Economic Performance. So basically, there will be a big hit to trade if there is a hard Brexit, right? Which is predicted to lower the path of GDP by 6.3 up to 9.5%, exactly what the Treasury forecasted over the next 10 to 15 years. Same holds true for foreign direct investment, right? There's about 28, so it was estimated that since the UK entered the EU that FDI increased by about 28%. And of course the largest benefactor of that FDI is the financial service industry, so we would expect that them, in addition to losing passporting rights, would also caution against a hard Brexit, right? And then I already talked about living standards. So all in combination, the lower path of growth, higher unemployment, and higher inflation will, of course, affect living standards across the field. It will hurt the poorest the most because, of course, they have a lower income overall. But relatively, it will hit all income classes, with the middle income just hit a little bit harder. And why all this, right? Why all this? Because people don't like EU immigration. And of course, the numbers show that between 1995 and 2015, EU immigration tripled from 0.9 to 3.3 million. It really jumped after the EU enlargement in 2004, and 29% of EU immigrants are now Polish, or were Polish in 2015. But then there are numbers, right? There are numbers. EU immigrants are more educated, younger, more likely to be in work, and less likely to claim benefits than UK-born. And that's a fact, right? UK areas with large EU immigration flows, there has been no greater fall in jobs or pay for UK-born observed than in other areas. That is mainly due to the financial crisis in 28. Then same holds true for changes in wages and unemployment rates for less educated UK-born, so those who fear mostly immigration of low-skilled workers from Eastern European countries. This shows very, very little correlation with changes in EU immigration, right? And then, in the end, EU immigrants pay more taxes than they take out in welfare, and they use less and also pay more taxes than they use public services. So there is basically what the numbers show. We, the UK, wins from EU immigration and doesn't lose from EU immigration, right? So we are actually facing a hard Brexit because we won before from EU immigration. So that's something to understand, and that's my provocation here that I'm happy to discuss later. Thank you very much. Do you have slides? Yeah?
Yeah, okay. I'll just...
Oh, you need the microphone.
Okay,
Oh, are you next? Who's next?
He's next.
Oh, you're next. Who's next?
It doesn't really matter. I don't remember by heart.
Do you have slides?
No,
yeah, I don't have slides. Do you?
Oh, Ben actually is supposed to be next.
Yeah.
If that, it doesn't matter. Okay.
It's okay? All right. I suggest we go, because of time concerns, that we keep, we have all the panelists and then all the speakers, and then in the end, we just go collect a few rounds of questions, if this is fine, so we can try to address them all together, okay? And also to try to keep it within time. Let's hope. Okay.
Would you like to follow order?
Yeah, if you can you go now? Yeah. I'll leave you with Davide Morisi from the. Thank you. Davide is a journalist by training. Is that correct?
Yeah, former journalist.
Former journalist, and works now for the Center for Media Pluralism and Freedom. There have been some concerns about the way media has addressed the arguments to leave and to remain in the EU. And he will be talking a little bit about that as well. I would just ask if we could have the lights on, since we don't have slides. I don't know where the light on, because the building is not. Ah, it's there. Okay, I'm sorry. I will turn on the light.
No, I think that's
Okay, this is fine. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. Is it working? I have some problems with this technology. Let's see. Okay, maybe I can keep it like this. Okay, so I didn't prepare any slides also because I didn't know exactly the format, so, but I will be brief, and I will just like to give you some thoughts about starting from some of my impression, and then a few things related to the research that I'm carried out together with some researchers on some research that I did on the Brexit referendum and also on other referendums, and especially on the role of information in the media. So I will not show you any evidence here, but you can believe me, there is evidence. In case you are interested in the studies, you can just email me, and I will be more than happy to send you some of the papers that we have done or that are in progress. Okay, just as a start, because I was thinking about this panel on Brexit, and then I was thinking about the day of the referendum and the general shock that I had. So at that time, I remember I was in Brussels for a conference, so kind of funny, exactly at the heart of the European Union. Were you there too?
Yeah, everybody was there.
Yeah, okay, exactly. And then I remember, so I was, then after the first day, I went home, and then I started to follow a bit the debate, then I fell asleep, and at 5 a.m. I just woke up, and I checked the phone, and I saw the final results from BBC. I just couldn't believe it, and then I fell asleep again, and then I woke up after a couple of hours thinking, oh, okay, that must have been a nightmare, and then it was actually true. And I mean, it's really strange, even if I had worked on this topic for a while, and I knew all the opinion polls, everything. I mean, we knew from the polls that the result was really close. And okay, we were expecting probably another result, but I mean, when the opinion polls are so close, it was also likely that a leave vote could prevail. And this is what happened. So this is just an introductory thing to mention. I mean, even when you are in political science, this thing can be very kind of shocking. And so one thing was in the debate then that followed, especially that vote, many people talk about the why. So the problem of having a referendum of such thing, this was something that was already debated after the British general election, but especially after that vote, there were many critiques about, okay, shall we ask people to vote on these things, or should be the elites to decide? So I've heard many people in academia, especially after this result, claiming being in favor of a very elitist approach. Okay, so maybe when it's about these topics, we should leave like the leaders to decide. We shouldn't give people the power to decide on these things. And this connects to, at the more general level, to the studies on referendums. So this is a topic that has been studied a lot, in particular in Switzerland, which is the country of direct democracy. But now, due to this spread of referendums, it's something that is becoming much more interesting also for the entire European Union. And not just for the EU, just a little parenthesis, you might know just a couple of weeks ago there was another big referendum in Colombia on a peace agreement with this terrorist group, the FARC, and just so it was a huge thing, but the voters rejected this peace agreement with a very tiny majority. So that was another example of a long process that got rejected in the end by the voters, contrary to all the expectations. So the point then is that, okay, so then how do people make decisions in referendums? So we know from studies in political science that there are several strategies, in particular in the case of referendums where political parties play a different or a weaker role compared to normal elections, because we are not voting for a party or a candidate, but people are voting on an issue. So when, and especially when there is a complex issue and highly salient issues, there are several strategies that people use. Some of these strategies are what we call heuristics or shortcuts. And for example, in some referendums, people, they just follow trust in the government. So whether they trust or they don't trust the government, they just vote in line with that. And, or partisanship. Or other people follow simply the status quo. Some people that just, they don't like changes in general, they just vote against any type of change. And this, partially, also, some of the strategies also happen were in place in the Brexit referendum, In particular, the fact that, as we know, one of the main drivers was this anti-globalization feeling. So it might be that that was a kind of a sort of a shortcut. So just people didn't want to embrace this kind of openness towards a global world, and they just voted against that, no matter what the implications of the referendum were. So that was just the quick shortcut to say, I will vote leave because of this. But there is also literature showing that, especially this is related mostly to the case of Switzerland, but also on referendums on European integrations, showing some positive sides, so that also people are able to process information, to base their decisions on the arguments that they receive. And it seems that there is something also based on the research that we carried out. And so we'll just give you some findings about the study that we did in Scotland and in the UK. About the question in this case is what is the effect of information and the media? Because it's normally in the public debate, we always hear that, I mean, media have an impact, but I don't know how many of you are in political science. This is also a big question, or in general in social science, to measure the effect of the media. That is quite difficult. So we could see in these studies that, firstly, that when people read arguments from both sides, we tend, or voters tend, to have these biases that are like confirmation biases, or what we know as selective exposure to information. So it seems that there is evidence also from the studies that we did in Scotland and in the Brexit referendum that people give much more value to the arguments that are in line with what they already thought about. So even when we present people with the same type of information, the same arguments are interpreted completely differently from different people. So then the question is that, okay, then is there any scope for information to change people's mind, to persuade people? It seems that there is some margin. It's not that everything is fixed. For example, we can see in these studies that, firstly, information is extremely beneficial for undecided people, which is intuitive, but again, in campaigns where there's a large share of undecided people, this means that the arguments that are put forward in the campaign are extremely important, and especially when the final result is so close, managing to convince the undecided can lead one side to win. There is also other evidence that even if people kind of give more value to the arguments that reinforce their predispositions, there is evidence that when they read arguments from both sides, this makes them less extreme. And especially, this happens both in Scotland and in the Brexit referendum. We could see that those who at the beginning had really strong opinions, either on both sides, after reading these arguments in a very short period, these were experimental studies, they become less extreme, which is something positive, at least in this is just a suggestion, like it's a short-term finding, but it shows that at least reading arguments from the other side can smooth the most extreme fringes of the electorate. And regarding another thing is that, so in line, talking about again indecision, another important thing in referendum campaigns in particular is this differences between risks and uncertainty. In particular, in these campaigns, normally when people vote, in a referendum context, one option carries more uncertainties than the other. One option is more uncertain, and normally this is the change option. So in the case of Scotland, it was voting for independence. In the case of Brexit, it was a vote for leave. As I read in an article by Timothy Garton-Ash, he said, I mean, Brexit is clearly riskier than Remain. And this is kind of undisputable. We can talk about also the risk of remaining, but at least in the short term, leaving the EU was something new for the voters. So this means that there is a sort of an imbalance between the risk and uncertainties that are implied in these two options. And this means also that information is really important to reduce the risk related to one option. So it might be, for example, and in the case of Brexit, or the arguments that were conveyed in the campaign, also they managed to portray the leave option as not as risky as it was, so to convince some of the voters to choose this option. There is also some evidence from another, this is a representative study that we did again during the EU referendum with researchers from the LSE, from Aarhus University. We wanted to see the effect of party queues and information. So here there is some evidence that when people see that they receive a queue, they receive information that their own party is aligned, is voting in a certain direction, this reinforces their support for an option. In particular, we told them in the Brexit referendum, we told them like a majority of your party is formally in favor of remaining, which was the case of all the main parties apart of the UKIP and the Conservative Party that was also split. But there is evidence that when people also, especially people who already feel close to a party, when they've been told explicitly that their own party is also clearly supporting one part, this also boosts their support, in this case for a Remain vote. On the other hand, we also could see in this type of study that the arguments against again the Leave and the Remain arguments had a very strong impact. So in this study, we had only people that clearly identified with a party, and we had only the Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem, and SNP. So we had a particular sample of voters that already felt close to these four pro-Remain or divided pro-Remain parties. And when they read an argument taken from the public debate, in this case it was an argument about immigration, when they read an argument in favor of leaving, they became significantly more in favor of remaining in the EU. And this was carried out, it was a very short argument, but still carried out in a proper setting. So it suggests that even if it suggests that information has a large effect, and this was kind of measured in a very short time, in a little experimental setting. But if you think about this in the broader campaign, or if you think about, okay, then over the months of the campaign, and thinking about how the media were portraying the different options, it's an indication that having a balanced, how do I say, a balanced picture of the debate, or the role of the media in putting forward arguments in favor of the two options is important, because that could convince even people that were strongly in favor of the other option. So I'm probably making a bit of it's a bit noisy and confusing, but the message was that so when we combine also evidence from different studies, this shows that the messages that are put forward by the media are definitely important in this whole picture. And this is also a claim for the fact that then this is what we do in this center at the UI, the Center for Media Pluralism. We try to measure or to assess the state of pluralism and media freedom in different European countries. And these studies show that it's important to have like a media landscape that is as balanced as possible, because this clearly has an influence, especially in such salient campaigns. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, I do. Does this work? Yes, excellent. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Andreas. I will be talking a bit about the drivers behind attitudes towards the European integration, building up a bit on what Davide was saying, and in a way showing a bit of a contrast to what Vera was saying, that sometimes in a way perceptions might be much more important than facts, and unfortunately sometimes the perceptions of the public and the elites are wrong, as Vera just highlighted. So what are some of the drivers of attitudes towards European integration? There's a seminal paper by Hoek and Marx, and they summarize it by the 3 C's, which is calculation, community, and cues. What do they mean by this? Well, one is people try to calculate the costs and benefit that come with further integration. So then we can ask ourselves, well, who are the winners of and losers of further integration? Then they say, well, it has something to do with the feelings of an attachment to a wider community. So in a way, do you perceive yourself as a British person, or do you perceive yourself as a European person? And, well, in a way, do you then also fear the other? Do you feel people who are non-British in that sense? Or is that, in a way, nothing that scares you even though you are British? And then finally, talking in a way similar to what Davide was saying, you can ask yourselves, well, where do the party leaders, where do prominent politicians stand on this issue? And because in a way you like these parties, you like these politicians, you trust them, you just listen to them, how they are going to vote, and then you do the same. Then you don't have to invest in a way a lot of time and resources into finding out about the European project. And of course, at least these three concepts are of course sometimes interrelated, and I'm not saying it's very easy sometimes to distinguish between the two. So let's focus on the first one, the cost and benefit calculations. So one example proposed by Gable and Palmer is, for instance, that citizens with a high status occupation are likely to favor the EU. Why? Well, they possess human capital, and they would benefit from lower trade barriers and increased geographical mobility of labor. So these are the ones who benefit in a way from globalization and from integration. They are happy to move between countries to find a higher paying job. Then on the other side, there are the citizens with low status occupations who are poorly paid, and they have few educational qualifications, and they are likely to oppose the EU integration. One reason for this is, because they face the competition of similarly low-skilled labor from other EU member states, or at least they perceive that this is the case, and they might not have talked to Vera before that actually a lot of high-skilled European immigrants go to the EU. And then, of course, they think, well, that limits their job opportunities, and this in turn drives down their wages, and that decreases their living standards. Here's a graph put together by Steve Fisher for his Elections, etc. blog, where he shows on the local authority level the proportion of people who voted for leaving the EU, and here's the proportion in that local authority that have a degree as the highest educational attainment. As you can see, there's a very strong negative relationship between the two. So the City of London has roughly 70% of people with a degree, about 20% voted leave, but in other places like Boston, where only 15% of people have a degree, nearly 80% of people voted to leave the EU. So there's, in a way, at least at the aggregate level, there's some strong correlational evidence to suggest that there might be something true to this story. Let's move on to the second driver, which is this attachment to the wider community. Let's say there are at least two components to it. One is how strongly attached you feel towards your culture, towards your society, and the values that come with it. And the complement, or in a way, a contradiction might be, well, does it come also with fears of others? So you can strongly identify with your culture, society, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you dislike other cultures, right? But it could mean the same in a way that this drives your identity. So if you perceive negative effects of immigrations, this might come with a lot of anxiety. And as Vera was already alluding to, this might have been what was going on. Here's a picture that I guess you have all seen before, which is this argument of let's take back control, signed here by leading campaigners that proposed this argument. And of course the question is here, well, why would we need to take back control if that's what we are doing at the moment, if you actually perceive that the people are similar to you who have that control at the moment? So in a way there's already a perception is that they are different from us, they want something different than we do, so we need to take back our control. In a way, a similar argument that maybe Scotland is doing at the moment with regard to Westminster. Now, is there something to it? How do Brits in general feel European? Here's evidence from the from the Eurobarometer, and this is the proportion of people who say they feel only let's say, British or only Luxembourg, so they don't have a shared identity with, say, let's say, I also feel European. So they just feel, they just identify with the nation. And then, for instance, Luxembourg and Germany, only 17% in Luxembourg say I'm just Luxembourgian, or a quarter of people say I'm just German in Germany. In contrast, the UK is on the other extreme, where 2/3 of people say I'm just British, I'm nothing else, right? Okay, or I'm just Scottish, I'm just English, I'm not European whatsoever. And Cyprus and Greece, maybe not surprisingly of what the EU did recently to them, also don't perceive themselves as European. The question of, oh sorry, I think I need to be closer to this. The question, of course, is, does this matter? So here's then the evidence of the British Attitude Survey from 2014, where just to do the cross-tab of, do you identify as a European or as a not European, and do you think Britain should continue in the European Union or should it withdraw? If you just focus here on this number, if you're European, then 92% of people say, yeah, let's continue in the EU. But if you perceive you're not European at all, you're just British, it drops down by 40 percentage points. So in a way, identity here might be a huge driver of whether or not you want to stay in the UK. There's some buts to it. First of all, because Scottish and Welsh identities actually have a positive correlation for European integration. So Nicola Sturgeon, for instance, is even willing to leave the UK just to stay in the EU. So something about this identity argument, to my mind, does not make complete sense. In addition to that, we know that these national identities remain fairly stable. So very few of you would think of themselves today as European, then the next day on British, and waver back and forth, so it's fairly stable. But the attitudes towards the EU are actually super volatile. So here's monthly evidence from the Continuous Monitoring Survey by Clark, Whiteley, and others, starting from 2004 up until the start of the campaign in December 2015. And the red line is disapprove of EU membership, and the inverse is approve of the EU membership. And you can just see there are huge changes. So sometimes the blue line is on top, sometimes it's way below. And in total, I think it's 26 percentage points that this varies just over 10 years, which is a lot. And national identities don't change in that way from one year to the other. So in a way, it cannot really explain, I guess, much of the variation that is going on there. So maybe there's something more short-term or a short-term part of this identity that might drive these attitudes. And it could be that this is this fear of others argument, because that you can invoke, of course, in the short term. In a way might speak to your attitude. And here's the picture of Nigel Farage posing in front of the campaign photograph or campaign poster, where it says in a way, well, we are already at breaking point. The EU has failed us all. So meaning here about the Syrian refugees, but also in a way, he's, I think, talking more about Britain and what they would have to suffer if all these people would come here, they would break apart. Here's again some evidence that there's a strong correlation between the perceived impact of immigration, here in this case on the economy. So higher points here are good impact, and here's bad impact. And on the vertical axis is the proportion of people who say that Britain should leave the EU. So if you perceive that immigration has a bad impact on the economy, you are 50% likely to say Britain should leave. But if you say I don't know, you give it an 8 or a 10, it's just 10 percentage points. So it's a 40 percentage point drop with the economy if you say immigration is bad. This does not have to be based in facts, right? So these are all perceptions. The same is, of course, a cultural argument that you can make. The impact of immigration on culture, there's a similar 40 percentage point drop from perceiving a bad influence to a good influence in support for leaving the EU. And then finally, what Davide was already talking about, these elite cues. They are sometimes an informational shortcut. I would like to pose the question to you all in a way. In this case, might parties be less important than politicians? So how does this shortcut work? As I said, you don't know much about an issue, or haven't really thought it through, but you know that in general you always agree with this party or with this politician. So you just find out by reading the media where they stand, and then you will vote accordingly. In this campaign, interestingly enough, the parties were hugely divided, I would say, and in a way, therefore, the voters didn't really have a chance in getting a cue from the parties, right? Because the Conservative, well, one reason why we had this referendum is because David Cameron wanted to solve an internal party issue by solving whether or not they should stay in Europe. So they were deeply divided. And of course, since many years, they have been sending contradictory messages about Europe. And of course, yeah, the cabinet was pretty much split on this issue. With regard to the Labour Party, you could say, yes, they were a bit more united. But, I mean, as the recent leadership election has shown again, there's a huge internal division over Corbyn's leadership, where, in a way, the MPs dislike him, but the members love him. And he publicly on radio also gave just a lukewarm support towards the European Union. I think he gave it a 7.5 on a 10-point scale. And afterwards, there were huge complaints that he wasn't really campaigning very much or very enthusiastically about the EU. So, and of course, if you're a Labour voter and you're already thinking, I'm not so sure about this EU thing, and then your party leader is not so sure, again, you might take this as a cue or at least as a confirmation. So then party attachments might have little influence on your vote, and instead what could happen is that charismatic leaders, I mean charismatic here in quotes, people like Boris Johnson, who himself wavered quite a lot and sent a lot of text messages to David Cameron whether or not he supports now the EU, and I think 10 minutes before he announced, he switched again towards leaving. So they could have played a much bigger role. So here's some preliminary conclusions. Again, all I wanted to suggest here is, in a way, a tool for thinking about what might drive, in general, attitudes toward EU integration based on this idea of calculations, community, and cues, and, in a way, walk with you through it, how one might apply this to the current EU referendum. This is not a huge evidence-based quantitative analysis. It's mainly based on anecdotes. But what they suggest is that, yeah, there's a strong correlation between education and the proportion of people who voted for Brexit. There might have been not so much the identity argument going on, but maybe more the fear of others in terms of immigration. And then finally, I think that the absence of a strong party cue, so if all the major parties would have been very enthusiastic about the EU, I would suggest probably the result would have been the opposite. And in addition to that, we have probably stronger personalities on the Leave side than we had on the Remain side, and this might also have influenced the election result. And that brings me to the end of my presentation.
I'm going to keep this brief, in part because the only thing that's legally certain about this is that absolutely nothing is certain. Although there is one thing that is certain, that is that the British media will try and find every single word it can that it can start with Brr, and add this to, so we have had Brexit, we've had Remain, we've had Nick Clegg's dubious Brunel, we have the Brexiteers. I'm going to add a few of my own. What is this Brevorce going to look like? And is it going to leave a really nasty Brexit wound? Now, out of curiosity, how many people here are from a legal background? Okay, so second question. How many of you have heard of Article 50? Exactly. So suddenly EU law matters. Now, in reality, EU law has mattered in many, many different ways for many years, but it's really now that people are showing a genuine interest in it. The other thing you found is that everybody now has an opinion on Article 50, despite the fact they have no actual legal background in which to actually look at Article 50. Now, one body that has been asked to look at Article 50 is the English court system. Now, you may have heard that there is an ongoing legal debate at the moment about the way in which the Brexit negotiations will take place, how Article 50 should be used, and whether Parliament should be involved in actually initiating the Article 50 process. What I would say is we have this court decision due in 2 weeks. It will be appealed. This will end up going to the Supreme Court because this is something that both the legal profession, the claimant that brought the case in the first place, but also the British government feel they cannot lose. Now, why is this? This is because this is a political situation that has very real legal consequences. So the thing to bear in mind first about the referendum is this referendum vote is not legally binding. The thing to bear in mind is that this is what they call a political consultative referendum, which means that if the government wanted to, from a legal perspective, it could ignore the result completely. Some people have suggested taking down EU flags off official buildings, pretending we're out of the EU for a couple of years, maybe changing the colour of the passports and seeing if anybody notices. In reality, this is probably not what's going to happen. There will be the initial triggering of Article 50, and from a legal perspective, this becomes very important, because this means there is a 2-year window for negotiations of the relationship with the European Union. At the end of this 2-year process, in principle, the UK is out. Now, if the UK is out without the conclusion of negotiations on access to the internal market, this puts the UK in a very, very difficult position, not only legally, but in terms of trade relations. And particularly for the area that I work in, it raises large questions as to the intellectual property protections that English firms, or rather British firms, will actually enjoy. So the thing to bear in mind, the UK has not had trade representation in the international community for many years at this point. The reason being that the external dimension of EU affairs, as they call it, has given the European Union competence over trade-related issues, which means the conclusion of trade agreements between states has often taken place between the EU and then what they call third-party nations. As a result, the UK concluded that there was not a need for UK-based legal experts in trade negotiation. We now have a situation where, if we were going to summarize, the UK's Department for Trade is an office with a phone in it and not much else. There's an added difficulty that there is the discussion that in order to get this legal expertise, we will have to hire non-British legal representatives to then negotiate the UK's position in exit negotiations, which again creates a very difficult situation for the UK. It is expected to get involved in the negotiation of complex legal relationships without the expertise to be able to actually conclude those negotiations. Now, it leads to other significant legal repercussions in other fields. It's not just about internal market access, it's about, in principle, the borders of the European Union. Now, I'm sure you've all read about this, but one area where this leads to large problems is the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Now, I'm not going to go into the complex and sometimes very unpleasant history of this border, but it is very important, essentially, for both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, that this continues to be, as they call it, a soft border, with people able to transfer between the two. The difficulty being, you will then have a situation in which people are entering and exiting the EU from a soft border. So one of the big discussions at the moment is, legally, how can the Republic of Ireland and the UK make this work? The answer is, as with everything else, at the moment, this is a purely political question. Legally, we have very little to work with, and legally, a lot is uncertain. So to go back to my area, which is intellectual property law, there are huge questions about what this means for UK-based firms, in a couple of different ways. I'll start very, very basically. Let's talk about trademark protection. So if you're a large company, such as Coca-Cola, you have huge financial value in your brand. In fact, Coca-Cola is a fantastic example because its brand is actually worth more than all its physical products put together. It is the value that the reputation of Coca-Cola has developed that is actually of significance to it. Now, the way that it works is that the European Union has something called the European Union Intellectual Property Office. And then here you can get something called the EU trademark. So you apply for a trademark, you apply to get your logo or your brand or your sound effect or anything else trademarked so that only you can use it. You apply once and you get protection across the entire EU, all 28 states with one registration process. The UK leaves the EU. They no longer have access to the European Union Intellectual Property Office. What this means for UK-based firms is they may not be aware of the fact that they then, if they only registered for an EU trademark, may no longer have trademark protection in the UK. So they're in a situation where they're protected in the 27 member states of the EU, but not in their own territory. A related situation is that of something called geographic indicators of origin. So you may have seen that there are certain foods or drinks that have little stamps on them with a small field, either in blue or red. Protects things like Parmesan cheese, protects prosciutto, it protects Parma ham, all these sorts of products. This protection is EU-based. It's registered at the level of the European Union. There is no domestic legislation here in the UK for this protection, which means that companies in the UK that benefit from this protection, such as firms involved in the production of Scottish salmon, which is a registered mark, or Melton Mowbray pork pies, lose the protection they have in the UK. So they'll be in the interesting situation where they're protected in the UK, sorry, in the EU, but not the UK. So this puts the UK in a difficult trade position, not only because of the negotiation of these sort of agreements, but also because of the awareness of the legal system that the firms themselves have, and the fact that they may not be aware of the fact that they have lost this protection. This leads to other issues with problems of counterfeit goods, and if the UK is no longer part of the customs union, it may actually lose the protection it gets from customs checks in parts of the Central Eastern European parts of the European Union that serve as the eastern border. It then becomes a potential shipment route for counterfeit goods into the EU via the UK. And what this means is that puts the UK in a situation where it has to do a lot in the way of additional checks in order to ensure that it is not allowing for counterfeit goods to move from the UK into the EU. So really the question then becomes, does the World Trade Organization do anything better for the UK in this respect? Short answer is no, not really. It's incredibly difficult to negotiate. It's an incredibly long and ongoing process. And furthermore, it is not necessarily a simple case of the UK just automatically defaulting to WTO rules. The reason being, if you want to trade with the EU specifically, there are additional requirements that go beyond WTO requirements the UK will be obliged to actually fulfill. Some of them dealing with issues such as competition law, some of them dealing with product safety, meaning that even if these laws no longer apply in the UK, they will still have to apply to the UK in order to then trade with the rest of the European Union. So that is a little crash course for any of you that don't have any background in European law.
So firstly, I haven't got a slideshow on this, but I'm actually going to be focusing on the internet and the role that played in the campaign. So if you do have like a smartphone or a tablet, just type in Young European Movement in Google and get on our Twitter, our Facebook, our website, and you can scroll back to May, June and see what I'm on about, because there are some cracking comments that some Brexiteers have left. So, you know, you can entertain yourself a little. So this was, for us, I think, as a United Kingdom, the first major political decision that was fought primarily on the internet. So there was leafleting, there was door-to-door campaigns, there were television appearances, but it was primarily an internet-based campaign. So we had the Scottish referendum, that was just Scotland, and we also have general elections, but they come along every 4 years. You make a mistake, you can correct it in 4 years' time, but we make a mistake and we're going to be paying for it for decades, if not centuries. So it was very interesting from a political point of view. And there are benefits to this being fought on the internet. So one of the benefits is youth participation. I mean, it went through the roof. No one was expecting that level of participation. I mean, it was still disappointing that it fell short of the 100% mark, but we did get large numbers of under 35s voting, and indeed 75% of the under 35s who did vote voted in favour of the European Union. It also leads to mass movements, so you can be spread across a country and still be connecting with people who have a common interest with you, and you get Facebook pages set up by 12-year-olds in their bedroom, generating thousands and thousands of likes and bringing people together to discuss these things and create grassroots pressure that instigates proper change. And also, I mentioned the common interest. You can get groups that are sort of sections of these interest groups who they don't live in a society where they live next door to someone who shares their interests. So, for example, we have an LGBT section of the Young European Movement. Some of these people live in Cambridge, some of them live in Cardiff, Aberystwyth, Aberdeen. They're across the UK and they come together on the internet because that is a very good and efficient way to meet and also allows them to exchange ideas efficiently. But there are, however, disadvantages to fighting this on the internet. So it is a very selective process we've found. So as a producer of this material, you are sort of firing your thoughts at the same kind of people. You think about Facebook. If I type a status saying, I'm voting to stay in today, the people who see that are my friends, and my friends are people who I associate with because we have common interests. So there's kind of that notion that we're preaching to the choir. And also as a consumer, it's very selective because we've got cookies, we've got people like Google and Facebook harvesting our information and targeting this information back at us. So, you know, we can have targeted adverts that will only focus on university students or only men or only people with an interest in the European Union or the English Defence League, and you can give them specific information. So there's an asymmetry going on here. And it's also extremely polarizing. We do have this bubble effect where everyone who likes the European Union, they're going to have their bubble, and everyone who doesn't is going to have their bubble. And then as you sort of preach to yourself, you become more and more self-assured, and you get the impression that the other team are completely wrong, completely irrational, and that breaks down any possibility of actually having a rational debate on it. And I think both sides were very guilty of that this time. So the first thing, wow, like a UKIP party conference. So the first thing I like to talk about is seeking out information, and the way we've selected our news has changed dramatically since the rise of the internet and smartphones and Kindles. So we gravitate towards the outlets that we agree with. So it's unlikely that most of us here read The Sun or the Daily Mail. You might. I'm not judging. I am. But we're going to read things like The Guardian or Al Jazeera or BBC, and we download those apps onto our phones. We search for it on the internet. We like it on Facebook, and we're forever getting information from the sources we choose to get the information from. Now, we limit ourselves by choosing where to read our news. And we're as much influenced by what we don't read as what we do. So one of the problems that has been building up over the years, and particularly in recent years since the rise of the internet, was that we don't receive enough information on the European Union. We don't know that we have European health insurance cards that guarantee us health care in any of the 28 member states and some others. And we don't get all of this good news. We get things like, oh, they're letting all the immigrants in, and they're going to let the refugees bomb us, and they're going to restrict our bananas, and we won't be allowed to eat Marmite in 3 years. We get stuff like that. We only hear the bad news, and that has been shaping society as much as, you know, what we do and what we don't do. So the underreporting of EU affairs has been a massive, massive issue, particularly for the people who read the tabloids. And this absence of information is just as damaging as any hysteria there's been on migration. And this is, of course, exacerbated now by the fact that we do download the apps we want. And you can actually select which topics you hear about now. If you have the BBC News app, you can say, I want to hear stuff about Europe. I don't want to hear stuff about America. I do want to hear stuff about the Middle East. And you can curate what you hear. So without proper coverage, however, we can't make good decisions. We've proved we can't make good decisions. So we do blame media outlets for being biased, and that's absolutely true. Media outlets are extremely biased. But we should also be blaming ourselves for only reading the ones we want to hear from. So if you always read The Guardian, go ahead and read The Sun. Or if you're always reading Al Jazeera, go and read BBC for once. Because you're as much responsible as your equal coverage as the news outlets themselves are. And then we move on to sharing information. And at the Young European Movement UK, we had a budget of nothing for our campaign. Because we're not actually a referendum campaign. We were founded in 1972, and we refused to be sucked into this in-out rhetoric. But we were. And so we had a social media-based campaign, and it was all completely unfunded. But we found this same problem as with the standard media. It was thoroughly selective, but it was less of a conscious decision. So depending on who liked us, who followed us, who subscribed to us, that depended on who we could spread our message to. And let's face it, if you go onto Facebook and like the Young European Movement UK, you're probably going to be pro-European. So again, we had this problem is that we were shouting to a room of people who already were on our side. We weren't talking to the people who actually needed speaking to. And then again, on like an individual level, like I said before, the friends you have tend to share your interests. So every time we shared something pro-European or posted about our feelings on Europe, everyone would like it. No one would challenge it because we are friends with people like ourselves. So again, we were sort of preaching to our own little European bubble. And then Facebook and Twitter and all of the platforms themselves come into this as well with their algorithms. So you can actually choose these days which tweets you see. You can report, say, I don't want to see tweets like this. So you don't have to. You can just filter out UKIP completely, or you can filter out any pro-European organization completely. Facebook algorithms are doing the same. So if you are particularly good friends with someone, they'll know that, and they'll boost their posts to the top. So you don't have to see the people from back home, maybe the racist uncle you don't really talk to. You won't see his posts. So again, you're in this little mindset that everyone agrees with you, and everyone you talk to will agree with everything you're saying. And if it's just a social thing, that's fine. You can post all the pictures of your parties you like, but as soon as that gets political, it becomes an issue, that you're just getting one side of a story. So there's this bubble. And then we move on to targeted advertising, and this has always been a thing. Adverts target a specific audience, but now that we have corporations like Google with massive amounts of information on you, your interest, your age, your location, anything, they can target advertising. And particularly popular during this referendum campaign were paid adverts on social media. So the In campaign and the Out campaign both spent millions advertising to people like you on Facebook and Twitter. And so they were still advertising to the people who, again, didn't need convincing. They would search for things like if you liked their page, or if you like pages like ours, they would target it at you. They would target it at young people because they knew they were the people who were going to vote in. And that's okay if you want to convince us to actually go to the ballot box. But if you're trying to change our opinion on Europe, you shouldn't be speaking to people like us. They should have been speaking to the wider world who weren't convinced of our opinions. So they were really targeting the wrong people. And also, a very obvious point, but one very important, there's a huge demographic that's being missed out if you are focusing on the internet. And we know from the statistics released the day after that it was the older generations who voted predominantly against the European Union. And coincidentally, it's also the older generations who don't normally have Facebook, and if they do, they don't really know how to use it. So you have to acknowledge these restrictions that you have, and you cannot base an entire campaign on the internet. So yeah, why is this a problem? There's the bubble effect, like I mentioned. You're sharing messages with a set community. That means they're not really reaching the people that they need to reach. It's also very polarizing, like I said. So you get the in team, you get the out team. We're both convinced we're right. We're both convinced the other team don't need to be argued with because they can't be argued with. And it wastes time and resources. Like I said, millions of pounds are being spent daily on advertising on Facebook, and millions of pounds were spent during the campaigns, and that was money that could have been spent knocking on doors. It could have been spent educating children in classrooms about the European Union to avoid something like this in future. So it's quite an inefficient way of getting a message across. But it's not all doom and gloom. So 75% of the Young European Movement's demographics, that's under 35, they voted in, like I said. We doubled our Twitter following, our Facebook likes increased by 600%, and stuff that we were posting got shared tens of thousands of times, and we're getting hundreds and thousands of likes on our posts. We were founded in 1972, like I said, and we're now at the strongest point in our lifetime. So we have more members than we've ever had before. So even if it didn't work to change the outcome of the referendum, it has worked, like I said, to encourage people with common interests to come together. So even if we have lost this vote, we haven't lost the capacity to actually campaign for what we believe in. And this is true of all groups that came about or grew as a result of the referendum. So it's not a complete loss, the democracy on the internet. but you do have to be wary of its limitations and then accept that it can help you in some ways, but also hinder you in others. Thank you.